The silence is what hit me first. Not a peaceful quiet, but a dead, empty silence where a familiar hum should have been. For 20 years, the low thrum of the irrigation pump was the heartbeat of our little cul-de-sac. It was the sound of stability. Now, it was gone. I was in the garage, my father's garage. It still smelled of him, cold metal, old oil, and sawdust. I was holding his old multimeter, the one with a spiderweb crack across the screen. I ran my thumb over the plastic. He'd been gone 5 years, but we'd been distant for 10. We never fixed that. And if you're a regular viewer on Karenology, you know some things, once broken, stay that way. That's when the pump went quiet. A loud, metallic click echoed from the utility shed at the edge of my property, and then, nothing. The silence felt wrong. It felt heavy. I put the multimeter down on the workbench and stepped outside into the crisp Oregon autumn air. The sun was low, casting long shadows. And there she was, Carol, the president of our homeowners association. She stood by the pump's control box, as neat and tidy as a freshly sharpened pencil. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at a tablet in her hands, her face lit by its cold blue light. She was hanging a brand new padlock on the steel door. I walked over, the gravel crunching under my boots. "Carol, what's going on?" She finally looked up, her expression perfectly neutral. It's the kind of neutral that takes practice. "Alex," she said, her voice as flat as a level. "The pump's motor exceeds the decibel limit stipulated in bylaw, 114C. The board passed an injunction. It's effective immediately." I stared at her. "The decibel limit? That pump has been running since this neighborhood was built. My father installed it." As I said it, my eyes drifted to my own front porch, and my stomach dropped. A thin, jagged line snaked its way up from the foundation. A new crack. It wasn't there last week. Have you ever seen a problem so clearly that it feels like a physical blow? "Carol," I said, my voice low and tight. "Our houses are built on clay soil. That pump keeps the moisture level stable. You turn it off, the ground dries, it shifts. You're going to crack our homes in half over a noise complaint nobody ever made." She adjusted her glasses with a precise, irritating little push of her index finger. "The rules are the rules, Alex. It's a matter of compliance." She said compliance like it was a sacred word. I pulled out my phone. I'm a city planner. I know the codes. I also know when a situation is about to go from a civil disagreement to a 911 call. I dialed the sheriff's office. A young deputy showed up, listened to my side, then listened to Carol's. He looked at her printed out copy of the bylaw, then back at the growing crack on my porch. He was sympathetic, but his hands were tied. "This is a civil matter, sir," he said, and you could hear the apology in his voice. But I wasn't done. I got the sheriff himself on the phone, Sheriff Miller. He's an old-school guy who understands that a cracked foundation is a bigger threat than a few decibels. He gave a direct order, turn the pump back on until the county engineer could assess the structural risk. For a moment, I felt a surge of victory. Carol's face tightened, but she complied. The deputy unlocked the box, flipped the switch, and the familiar, life-giving hum returned. He gave me a nod and left. I watched Carol walk back to her perfectly manicured house without another word. I thought, for a brief, stupid moment, that it was over. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The silence was back. It pressed in on me, heavy and final. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to the utility shed. The padlock was untouched, but when I opened the control box, I saw it. The main breaker had been professionally rewired. A tiny, gleaming new component was rigged to the trip switch. It was designed to shut down the system at the slightest power fluctuation. It was sabotage, disguised as a safety feature. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a declaration of war. I stared at the gleaming alien component someone had expertly grafted onto my father's work. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. This wasn't some clumsy vandalism. This was precise. It was surgical. And it was meant to look like an accident, a technicality. The cold night air bit at my skin, but a different kind of chill was working its way deep into my bones. This was a game, and Carol had just shown me she knew how to play it far better than I did. The next day, I decided to fight her on my own turf. Procedure. As a city planner, I live and breathe bylaws, codes, and regulations. I spent the entire morning digging through the county's public records and the Homeowners Association's own convoluted book of rules. I was building a case, brick by logical brick. I had the sheriff's initial report, the photos of the sabotage breaker, the original specs for the pump proving it was within noise limits when installed. I felt the familiar comfort of being prepared. I was going to walk into that evening's emergency HOA meeting and dismantle her argument with a calm, undeniable presentation of the facts. What a fool I was. The community hall was buzzing with a nervous energy. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and cheaper gossip. I saw neighbors huddled in small groups, whispering, casting glances my way. Some offered a weak, sympathetic smile. Others looked straight through me. Carol was already at the podium, arranging her papers with the serene confidence of a hangman preparing the noose. She owned this room. I waited my turn. When I stood up, I laid it all out. I presented the photos of the tampered breaker. I explained the geomechanics of clay soil, the certainty of foundation damage. I spoke not as an angry homeowner, but as a planner, a professional. This isn't about one bylaw, I concluded, looking around at the tense faces. This is a deliberate act of sabotage that puts every single one of our homes at risk. There was a murmur of agreement. I felt a sliver of hope. For a second, I thought logic might actually win. Then Carol stepped up. She didn't even look at my evidence. She smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Thank you, Alex, for that passionate presentation," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "You're right. This is about risk, and it's about shoddy workmanship." She held up a single piece of paper, a ghost from the past. "I had our records pulled," she announced to the room. "This pump, the one causing all this trouble, the too loud, outdated pump, it was installed 15 years ago by a local company that went out of business shortly after, a company owned by a Mr. Robert Miller." The name hung in the air, my father's name. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the worn linoleum floor. She let the silence stretch, twisting the knife. "That's right," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "Alex's father. So, you have to ask yourselves, is our neighbor fighting for our safety? Or is he using his position as a city planner to cover up for his own family's questionable legacy?" It was a masterstroke, a public execution. In 30 seconds, she had transformed me from a concerned neighbor into a corrupt official with a conflict of interest. She had taken my deepest personal wound, my unresolved history with my dad, and turned it into a public spectacle. Have you ever been hit so hard you can't even breathe? My carefully constructed case dissolved into dust. The whispers in the room were different now. They were laced with suspicion. I was no longer one of them. I was the son of the man who started it all. The vote to keep the pump off was almost unanimous. I walked out of that hall alone. The cool night air felt like a slap. I sat on my porch steps, the crack in the foundation beneath my feet seeming to mock me. It wasn't just concrete anymore. It was a fault line running right through my life, separating me from my past, my neighbors, my home. Across the street, through her brightly lit window, I saw Carol talking on the phone. She was laughing. Then she looked up, as if she could feel me watching. She caught my eye from across the cul-de-sac, and with one long, elegant finger, she slowly drew a line in the air. A crack. The line she drew in the air hung there long after she was gone, a phantom crack in the darkness. I just sat on my cold porch steps, the silence from the pump shed now feeling less like an absence of sound and more like a presence. It was the sound of my own defeat. I had walked into that meeting armed with facts, logic, and proof. She had walked in with a ghost, and the ghost won. The next few days were a blur of quiet hostility. Neighbors who used to wave now found something fascinating on the ground when I walked by. I was a pariah in my own neighborhood. I spent hours staring at the pump's original schematics, at the county codes, trying to find an angle I'd missed. But it was useless. I was trying to solve a math problem, and she was waging a war of the heart. I was out front, pulling a few dying weeds from a flower bed, when Ben's mail truck rattled to a stop. Ben's been our mailman for 30 years. He has a face like a road map of our town, and knows more about its history than the local library. He handed me a stack of bills and junk mail. "Tough crowd the other night," he said, his voice a low gravel. He didn't look at me with pity, just a kind of weary understanding. "You could say that?" I mumbled. He leaned against his truck, adjusting his cap. Knew your dad, Robert. He was a bull, that one, stubborn as they come. But his work was solid. He paused, then added, almost as stubborn as a Preston. The name didn't register at first. Preston? Ben nodded slowly. Carol's family, before she married. The Prestons had a little electrical company back in the day. Decent enough, but always cutting corners. He looked off into the distance, remembering. About 20 years ago, the city put out a big contract for all the new subdivisions. It was the kind of job that makes or breaks a company. It came down to two bidders, Preston Electrical and your old man. Suddenly, I stopped pulling weeds. The air grew still. Have you ever had a moment where the past reaches out and grabs you by the throat? Your dad won it, Ben said simply. Better bid, better materials, no contest. The Prestons couldn't recover. Their business folded in a year. They blamed your dad for everything, said he played dirty, even though everyone knew Robert won it fair and square. He looked me straight in the eye. They never forgave him for it. It hit me like a physical blow. The noise complaints, the personal attack, the obsession. It was never about the pump. It was never about the bylaws. This was a ghost story, a 2 decades old vendetta passed down to the next generation. She wasn't trying to enforce a rule. She was trying to tear down the last thing my father built in this neighborhood. She was trying to finish the job and break a Miller. A cold, hard anger replaced the confusion in my gut. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in days. I was done playing her game of rules and procedures. If she wanted to make this personal, then that's what it would be. Thanks, Ben, I said, my voice different now, harder. He just nodded, as if he knew he'd just handed me a key. He got back in his truck and drove off, leaving me standing in the silence. But it was a different silence now. It was the quiet before a storm. My storm? I went inside, my mind racing, a new, dangerous plan beginning to form. As the front door clicked shut, the mail slot on the door clanged loudly. I flinched. Another letter had been pushed through, separate from the stack Ben had given me. It must have been hand-delivered. It was a thick cream-colored envelope with the Homeowners Association logo embossed in the corner. My name was typed on the front. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. It wasn't a letter. It was an invoice. A bill for $2,500. The charge description read, Emergency Hazardous System Inspection and Report. Below it, in bold red letters, was a warning. Payment due in 15 days to avoid lien against property. The invoice felt heavier than it should, as if the paper itself were made of lead. $2,500. It wasn't just a bill, it was a threat. A lien on my house. She was moving from social pressure to financial warfare. I crumpled the paper in my fist, the sharp edges digging into my palm. The anger I'd felt after talking to Ben was now white hot. I spent the next day trying to fight it, the only way I knew how, with reason. I called Susan, a retired lawyer who lived down the street and had, until recently, been a quiet ally. I explained the situation, the vendetta, the bogus invoice. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, distant. Alex, she said, and I could hear the weariness in her tone. The inspector's report is official. The Homeowners Association is within its rights to bill for safety assessments. Fighting this will be expensive, and honestly, with your family connection to the pump, the perception is just not good. Perception. Not truth, not justice. Perception. She was right, of course. Carol had framed the narrative so perfectly that the facts didn't matter anymore. Susan wished me luck, but the subtext was clear. I was on my own. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, not with a bang, but with a quiet, polite withdrawal? It stings worse than any shouting match. That night, a truck I didn't recognize pulled up to the pump shed. A man in a clean work uniform got out. He spent about 10 minutes inside the shed and then slapped a bright red tag on the control box door before driving away. I waited until his taillights disappeared before I walked over. The tag was an official-looking, danger, do not operate notice. It declared the system electrically unsafe and cited a dozen code violations. It was signed by a certified electrical inspector. It was her master move. With that tag, it was no longer an HOA dispute. It was a state-level safety violation. No one could legally turn the pump back on now. The system was dead, and she had killed it with a piece of paper. This was her victory. and the red tag was her flag planted on conquered territory. She didn't waste a moment. An email blast went out to the entire neighborhood with the inspector's full report attached. It was a work of art, full of technical jargon about ground faults, improper amperage, and fire hazards. It painted a picture of a ticking time bomb my father had installed and that I was recklessly trying to restart. It ended with a triumphant note from Carol. The safety of our community is now secured. My phone buzzed with notifications. The neighborhood group chat lit up. People were thanking Carol for her diligence, for protecting them. My reputation, already in tatters, was now completely destroyed. I was the villain who had almost burned down their homes. I felt something inside me break. All the fight, all the anger, just drained away, leaving a hollow, empty feeling. I went back to my father's garage. The smell of oil and sawdust was no longer comforting. It was the scent of failure. I saw the cracked multimeter on the workbench. My father, his legacy. All I had done was drag his name further through the mud. Maybe they were right. Maybe he did cut corners. Maybe I was just a fool defending a ghost. I slumped onto the old wooden stool, the same one my dad used to sit on. I put my head in my hands. The silence from outside was absolute. The houses in our cul-de-sac, the ones my father had helped build, were now slowly, silently cracking. And it was my fault. I had lost. I stayed there for what felt like hours, surrounded by my father's tools, his silent accusers. I was ready to give up, sell the house, move away, and leave the ghosts of this place behind. Then my eyes landed on a dusty leather-bound manual on a high shelf. It was thick and heavy, with the logo of the pump manufacturer embossed on the front. I'd seen it 100 times, but never paid it any mind. On a whim, with nothing left to lose, I pulled it down. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, dancing in the single beam of light from the garage window. I blew the dust off the cover and opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle. I flipped through schematics, installation guides, parts lists, and then I found it. The original factory specification sheet, the one printed before the pump ever left the factory. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers, motor model, voltage, RPMs, and then a line that made my heart stop. Operating noise level, 55 dB at 10 feet. I knew our HOA bylaw 114C by heart. The limit was 60 decibels. The pump wasn't too loud. It had never been too loud. Her entire premise, the spark that started this whole fire, was a lie. But that wasn't the part that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was the next section, the electrical requirements. My dad's handwriting was in the margins, neat and precise, just as I remembered it. He'd made a note next to the recommended breaker model. Use Cutler hammer CH, higher trip tolerance, safer. I looked at the photo I'd taken of the sabotaged breaker. It wasn't a Cutler hammer. It was a cheap, off-brand model, the one the inspector's report had conveniently failed to identify. Then I looked at the inspector's report again, reading the fine print this time. The inspector's name was David Preston, Carol's brother-in-law. The plan clicked into place in my mind, cold and perfect. She thought she'd buried me under a mountain of paper, but she'd made one mistake. She left behind a witness that couldn't be bought or intimidated, the machine itself, and a report from a crooked inspector who had documented his own crime. My father's voice echoed in my head, a phrase I hadn't thought of in years. A piece of paper can lie, he used to say. A specification sheet never does. That old manual wasn't just paper and ink. It was a map that showed me not just where Carol had lied, but exactly how to prove it. The despair that had settled in my bones evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I finally understood. I couldn't win by arguing. I had to demonstrate. I had to make the truth so physical, so undeniable, that no one could ignore it. My first call was to Susan, the retired lawyer. "I know you're out," I said before she could protest. "I'm not asking for legal help. I need a favor. Your husband's birthday party is next Saturday, right? The big neighborhood barbecue?" There was a hesitant pause. "Yes. Why?" "I need you to make sure Carol is there," I said, "and her inspector brother-in-law, David. Tell them it's a celebration. Tell them it's a chance to mend fences. Tell them whatever you have to. Just get them there." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her legal mind. She was connecting the dots. "Alex," she said, her voice no longer distant, but filled with a spark of intrigue, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to run a little test," I said, "and I'm going to need an audience." Next, I called the one person I knew I could count on, not for legal advice, but for something far more valuable, a gut understanding of fire and risk. Ben, the mailman, had given me Carol's history, but I needed the fire marshal. I called his personal number. "Marshal Thompson, it's Alex Miller. I have reason to believe there's an active and immediate fire hazard in my neighborhood's utility system. I'm going to be conducting a public safety demonstration next Saturday at 5 p.m. I think you'll want to be there." I gave him the address of Susan's barbecue. The final piece of the puzzle was in my father's garage. Tucked away in a dusty steel cabinet was his old set of professional-grade diagnostic tools. Among them was a state-of-the-art infrared thermometer, a device that could measure temperature variations with pinpoint accuracy, and of course, the cracked multimeter. They felt different in my hands now, not relics of the past, but weapons for the future. The day of the barbecue arrived with a perfect, crisp autumn sky. Susan's backyard was the heart of our cul-de-sac, and it was filled with neighbors. The air smelled of grilled burgers and nervous tension. I saw Carol holding court near the dessert table, looking smug and victorious. Her brother-in-law David was beside her, looking bored. They thought this was their victory lap. I waited until everyone had a plate and had settled into their lawn chairs. Then I walked to the front of the yard, near the street, where the pump's utility shed stood like a tombstone. I wasn't carrying documents or legal briefs. I was carrying my father's tool bag. All conversations died down. Every eye was on me. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet. "I know there's been a lot of talk about the pump, about safety, about the rules." I looked directly at Carol. And Carol is right. Safety is the most important thing. I opened the door to the control box, revealing the red tag for all to see. According to this tag, and the inspector's report, this system is a fire hazard, but I think it's important for everyone to understand why it's a hazard. I pulled out my father's multimeter. "This device measures electrical current," I explained simply. "The sabotage breaker in this box is designed to trip under a normal load. But what happens when it's forced to run?" I bypassed the faulty trip, and for a heart-stopping moment, the pump roared to life. The familiar hum filled the air, but it sounded strained, angry. Then I aimed the infrared thermometer at the control box. A small red dot appeared on the metal casing right over the new breaker. I turned the display so everyone could see the numbers. "The safe operating temperature for a breaker like this is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit," I said calmly. The numbers on the display started to climb. 95, 105, 120. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "The inspector's report," I continued, my voice steady, "notes that this system is improperly wired, and he's right, because this cheap aftermarket breaker can't handle the load. It's overheating. At 150 degrees, the plastic casing begins to melt. At 180, it can ignite." The numbers climbed past 140. I could see panic in people's eyes. They were looking at Carol now, not me. David, the inspector, had gone pale. I held up the factory manual. The original specifications for this pump, installed by my father, required a Cutler hammer breaker, a breaker designed to handle this exact load safely. But the one in there now? It's a death trap, a fire waiting to happen. I looked straight at David, and you, as a certified inspector, signed off on it. The number hit 165, a faint wisp of smoke, smelling of burning plastic, curled up from the control box. Someone screamed. That wisp of smoke was more powerful than 1,000 pages of evidence. It was real. It was happening right now. The smell of hot melting plastic cut through the aroma of barbecue. The red numbers on the thermometer's display ticked past 170. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals, was now a single entity, united by a primal fear of fire. Their eyes darted from the smoking control box to Carol's face, which had turned the color of ash. "What's going on here?" a deep voice boomed from the edge of the crowd. It was Fire Marshal Thompson. He pushed his way to the front, his face a mask of grim professionalism. He took one look at the thermometer reading, one sniff of the air, and his eyes narrowed. He didn't look at me. He looked at David, the inspector. "You signed off on this?" Thompson's voice was dangerously quiet. David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Carol, pleading for help, but she was frozen, her carefully constructed world literally going up in smoke. "This isn't a code violation," Thompson said, his voice rising now for everyone to hear. "This is willful negligence. This is a criminal act. You installed or approved a device that you knew would fail, creating an imminent fire risk for every home on this street." He turned to a deputy who had arrived with him. "Secure the panel. Get statements from everyone." Then he looked at Carol and David. "You two, don't go anywhere." It was over. The game was over. I reached into the box and shut down the power. The angry hum of the pump died, and the silence that returned was filled with the frantic whispers of the crowd. It wasn't a vote or a bylaw that defeated her. It was physics. It was the undeniable truth of heat and electricity. Her own weapon, the obsession with safety, had been turned against her in the most public way imaginable. The next few hours were a whirlwind of flashing lights and official statements. The sheriff arrived, and after a short, intense conversation with the fire marshal, he walked over to Carol. Her face had collapsed. The mask of calm superiority was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly panic. "Carol," Sheriff Miller said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "you and your brother-in-law are coming down to the station. We have a lot to talk about." As the deputy led her away, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But it was impotent, a fire that had burned out. The neighbors surrounded me, their faces a mixture of shock, guilt, and awe. They apologized. They clapped me on the shoulder. They thanked me for saving their homes. It should have felt like a victory, but it just felt empty. I had won, but I had to nearly burn the neighborhood down to do it. Later that night, after the last of the official vehicles had gone, Susan found me sitting by the now sealed utility shed. She handed me a cold bottle of water. "That was quite a show, Alex," she said softly. "It wasn't a show," I replied, my voice hoarse. "It was the only move I had left." "I know," she said. "Your father would have been proud." Her words hit me harder than I expected. My father. I had spent so long running from his shadow, so long resenting his stubborn, unyielding ways. But in the end, it was his stubbornness, his meticulousness, his belief in doing things the right way that had saved me. I had cleared his name, but more than that, I had finally understood him. A few days later, a city engineering crew came out. They ripped out the sabotage breaker and the cheap wiring. They installed a new, top-of-the-line Cutler hammer breaker, exactly the one my father had specified in his notes all those years ago. They turned the pump on, and the familiar healthy hum returned to the neighborhood. The heartbeat was back. The homeowners association was in shambles. Carol and her brother-in-law were facing serious criminal charges. But that wasn't the end of it. The city, having been alerted to the potential for foundation damage, was talking about a special assessment, a new tax on all of us to fund a massive multi-million-dollar soil stabilization project. I had won the battle, but it felt like I might have just started a whole new war, one that would hit everyone in their wallets. And in the middle of it all, I got a call from the mayor's office. "Alex," the mayor said, "we've been impressed with how you handled this. We're launching a new citywide infrastructure modernization program. It's a big project, a career maker, and we want you to lead it." The offer hung in the air, a golden opportunity, a chance to move up, to leave this little cul-de-sac and its drama behind. It was everything I thought I wanted. But I looked out my window at the quiet street, at the houses my father helped build, at the utility shed humming away, and I thought about his old, cracked multimeter sitting on the workbench. I held the phone to my ear, the mayor's offer echoing in the quiet of my house. A career maker, a way out. For a moment, I saw it all clearly. A corner office downtown, important meetings, a life built on plans and projections, far away from the messy reality of cracked concrete and neighborhood vendettas. It was the safe path, the smart path. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," I said, my voice steady. "That's a very generous offer, but I have to decline." There was a stunned silence on the other end. I don't think he was used to being turned down. "May I ask why?" he finally managed. I looked at my father's multimeter on the workbench. The crack in the screen seemed to catch the light. "Because," I said, "I think I've just found a new job." I didn't go into city planning to draw lines on a map. I did it because, like my father, I believed in building things that last, things that work, things that people can count on. And I had almost forgotten that. This whole ugly business with Carol had been a brutal, painful reminder. Instead of taking the mayor's job, I did something that made no sense to anyone but me. I cashed in a portion of my retirement savings. I went down to the county clerk's office and filed the paperwork to reactivate my father's old business license, Miller & Son Electrical. The and son part had been dormant for 20 years. It was time to wake it up. My first contract was with my own neighborhood. The Homeowners Association, now under new, humbled leadership, hired me to conduct a full audit and upgrade of the entire irrigation system. The special assessment from the city was still a threat, but I found a series of state grants for community infrastructure resilience that could cover most of the cost. I spent my weekends not in an office, but in crawl spaces and utility sheds, my hands dirty, the smell of dust and old wiring in my nostrils. It was hard work. It was humbling work, and I had never felt more alive. I was no longer just a planner. I was a builder again. I was fixing things. One Saturday afternoon, I was finishing the wiring on the new pump system. I heard a hesitant voice behind me. "Mr. Miller?" It was the teenage kid from next door, the one who used to avoid my gaze. He was holding a small broken drone. I heard you're good at fixing things." I looked from his hopeful face to the complex tangle of wires in his hands, and I smiled, a real smile. "Pull up a stool," I said. "Let's take a look." I won. But my victory wasn't in seeing Carol get community service and a mountain of legal bills. It wasn't in the public apologies from my neighbors. The real victory was something quieter. It was the moment I realized I wasn't running from my father's legacy anymore. I was building on it. The anger and resentment I'd held onto for so long had finally given way to a quiet, profound respect. We had finally made our peace. My dad's old multimeter still sits on the dashboard of my work truck. The screen is still cracked. I could easily afford a new one, a better one. But I don't want a new one. That crack isn't a flaw anymore. It's a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the things that are broken are the things that teach us the most. A reminder that you don't find yourself by moving up in the world, but by digging down to the foundations and making sure they're solid. What would you do? Would you take the big promotion, or would you stay and fix what's broken right in front of you? Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight for what's right against all odds, maybe hit that like button. It lets me know I'm not the only one out here.